I'm a fan of old houses. I have read a good deal about them in books, and I also enjoy reading old houses. How do you read a house? Well, you have to know a little bit about history, and a bit about construction, and a little bit about economics, and a bit about social structures at the time the house was built. With a little practice, you can know immediately whether a house was built in 1840 or in 1920. Maplewood has both kinds. You can distinguish a federal style from a Greek revival style, and you can know that colonial is not a style at all, except in revival, but in fact colonial was an era, pre-1776. Before I run on about houses, at tedious length, I should warn you, I'd like to paraphrase a few points from the passage we just read from 2 Samuel. About the house of cedar, God asked, "Did you hear me ask for a fancy house?" And he said, "I will make of you, David, a house. Your offspring will establish his kingdom. I will be a father to him, and he shall be a son to me." Now Nathan, the narrator, like me, like a lot of us actually, takes God so literally, just as I did with the story of the 3 little pigs. But I think there's some room to be literal about the passage, as well as room to look into the figurative interpretations that foreshadow the coming of Christ. I'm going to use as an example our house, my house, the Lunde house. Our house is a wood-framed stucco with deep overhanging eaves supported by exposed rafters under the hip roof. Originally, it was asymmetrical in massing, with a sun porch that was so ubiquitous that it is called a Maplewood room in the trade. In the 1980s, it had an addition that made it symmetrical, audible sigh. In style, it is a simplified Tuscan farmhouse with arched windows on the front porch loggia. Our house was built in 1916. Let's read a few stories. In the use of 2 hinges per door rather than the usual 3, we can read that the builder, who was most likely Kenneth Dalzell, was experiencing the bite of inflation during the European phase of the World War and was looking to save money. The lack of a steel fireplace damper above the firebox is another indication that metal was expensive. The use of rough sawn white pine joists with knots and the use of clear, planed, knot-free 3/4 inch beadboard, it's likely longleaf pine, and that's the stuff that you see on porch ceilings, and they used that as a subfloor rather than the more typical rough sawn white pine shiplap in a 5/4 inch thickness. That indicates that framing timber was in very short supply at that time. Incidentally, we can read that the use of the old style 2x4, the actual 2x4, which came from our house, makes that house built of white pine that came from the great forests of Michigan and Wisconsin and Minnesota, and that were logged so heavily that they were gone by 1920. At that point, we turned to the west and began shipping wood, cedar and fir, wood that is extremely splintery, wood that if you try to use it in a rough sawn condition will tear your hands to pieces in 5 minutes, wood that required planing to make it smooth so that carpenters could work with it, and that's how we got dimensional lumber. You start with a 2x4 and you take 3/16 off each side to make it smooth enough, and it's still a 2x4, only a plain 2x4. Dimensional lumber. So now the quiz is, you passed the quiz. Thanks very much, guys. Another story. The fact that there's no lead used anywhere in the house. Not in the pipes, not in the windows, not even, sadly for us, as a termite barrier on top of the foundation below the sill plate. All of these things indicate that in 1916, sales of lead to Britain and France to make bullets were affecting decisions made in the building of houses over here in peacetime. You can read changes in how our house was used over time. The built-in bookcases next to the fireplace were once a common feature in craftsman-influenced houses. Our bookcases are missing. You can read their absence in the plaster with a strong, raky light held against the wall. You can also read their footprints in the flooring. The white oak flooring was used in the main part of the room, but it was patched in with cheaper red oak when the bookcases were removed. Different species take the stain differently. It looks like a skin graft. Our house has signs of more recent changes as well. It had a TV aerial on the chimney until a few years ago when we pulled it down. Speaking of the chimney has a new stainless steel cap with a damper on it, finally, that protects the masonry from snow and rain and keeps the heat in the house when it's cold. Not all of the changes that have been made to the house, I'm sorry to say, were good. In my daughter's bedroom windows, the sash cords were replaced by a, quote, handyman. He was the first and last time we hired anybody who self-styles himself as a handyman. He installed the heavier sash weights on the lower sash, he said, to make it easier to lift. He was apparently ignorant of physics. The heavier sash weights go on the upper sash to keep it fast against the jamb and not sliding down. He was a moron, but I digress. More positively, in the dining room, the yellow birch, plate rail, and woodwork is aglow after the careful removal of decades of paint and the reversal of a botched stripping job by the previous owners. That wood has a new lease on life, having been sanded down with 60 grit, then 80 grit, then 100, 180, and finally 220 grit sandpaper before it was stained and given 3 quarts of shellac in a 1.5 pound cut by yours truly. I didn't add up the hours I spent in the summer and fall of 2009 sanding and staining woodwork and patching the cove ceiling of the dining room, but it was a lot of hours. Surely it was far more hours than the original workmen spent in cutting, installing, sanding, and staining the woodwork originally. Undoing damage often takes far more time than leaving things alone. There's another reason I like working on an old house. You get to touch things that no one else has touched or since the house was built. You feel closer to the people who built it. You get to put your fingertips on the bare wood that was last exposed to air when Woodrow Wilson was being re-elected president. For me, strange as it may sound, I can almost feel the pulse of our house's many occupants over the years, over the century plus since it was built. I can almost hear their conversations. And I know that because we cared properly for our house. Some future owners in the distant future, I hasten to add, will be able to feel my pulse and hear my voice and maybe even see my bloodstains in the workshop. But that's a story for another day. Some of the stories that our house tells are ones that we today are ashamed to read. The softwood birch veneered doors, the cheap doors that were stained to imitate mahogany, those doors that led from the kitchen and pantry areas to the front hall and to the dining room used to have bolts on them. Bolts that could be thrown from only one direction. Bolts that could keep the help from entering the front of the house, if the mistress of the house so chose. And in the basement, a patch in the concrete is all that remains of a single toilet with a single bare light bulb hanging above it. A toilet intended for the use of the help and no one else. A toilet accessible to the cellar door that could be shared by the daymaid and the gardener. Our house, built in 1916, bespeaks a time when segregation by class and by race was normal in what is today the heart of liberal New Jersey. The tales are there if we but listen. We don't have statues of Confederate generals, but we do have the signs of the times all around us. What can we learn for our own future? Well, we can learn that we must build for the ages, and we must not build to impress the superficial dolt. I see these McMansions being built today, happily. They're not encroaching too heavily on Maplewood yet. And I know that they are being built using second and third growth lumber, finger-jointed wood in sleazy windows wrapped in vinyl for, quote, durability and, quote, low maintenance. They're built in preposterous styles that would have Vitruvius's ashes spinning in their urn and Palladio's corpse spinning in his grave. These modern-day prodigy houses will rot and decay within a generation. They will be unsalvageable in 50 years and will mercifully return to the muck of which they were fashioned. If we're not careful, we will arrogate to ourselves the construction of prodigy houses of a tangible sort, of a perishable sort, when in truth we should be investing in intangible houses of an imperishable sort. Houses that are not built of blood lineage, the line of David, not built out of only one material, not houses that celebrate some genetic purity, but houses that build on the lineage of love and of shared passions and of kindred spirits. Let's turn to Ephesians again. I'll paraphrase some passages. Jesus has broken down the dividing wall, that is, hostility between us. He's removed the bolt from the dining room door. One new humanity is in place of the two. We are citizens of the household of God, built on the foundation of the apostles and the prophets, with Christ Jesus as the cornerstone. The whole structure is joined together, in whom you also are built together spiritually into a dwelling place for God. Our house, this house, is both a tangible asset and an intangible one. I'm ever the literalist like Nathan. I've spoken far too long about the tangible side of things. Let's focus for a minute before I close on the intangible. Of what materials are we to build this intangible house? This ageless, imperishable, yet always adaptable structure in which we invite society to dwell in imitation of paradise here on earth. Are we to use the societal equivalent of shoddy workmanship with schools that fail to prepare our children to serve in society? Are we to use finger-jointed wood that will decay? Are we to clothe ourselves in vinyl to be low maintenance, forgetting that maintenance is the point of keeping a house up? Well, maybe Cher can get away with vinyl siding, but we can't. By the way, have you seen her in Mamma Mia? Here we go again. She really looks great. And she's definitely a spokesperson for historical preservation. Is our house, this house, to be a simplistic fairy tale structure built like the Three Pigs houses with only one material? Or does our house demand all kinds of people, all kinds of materials? The flinty, stony people to whom we hold fast, and the warm, comforting people who, like a window, shine light out into the community, and who, like a door, invite members of our community into our house. People who give the homeless a bed to spend a safe night. That's the kind of house we should build. We know the answers to these questions. Our house will not be divided against itself. Our house is not built on sand, but is built upon a firm foundation. Thank you.